we're going to start. So a word about the Global Interdependence Center, which many don't know. My bad. And the Global Interdependence Center has spent years convening from a neutral position in terms of policy and politics, a dialogue. That's what it does. It does it all over the world. It will do it in Buenos Aires on March 7th and 8th or 8th and 9th? 7, 8, and 9. And anybody in this room who at the last minute would like to have a Malbec and a good steak is welcome to join us. And if you would like to join us and not have a Malbec and a good steak, you can do that too. So that's the Global Interdependence Center. There's information on it, and you're invited to become members and to learn more about it and participate with us. We have partnerships with universities and central banks and governments all over the world, and USF Sarasota-Manatee is one of them. Let me just say a second word. One of the partners along the way, many times, is the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And with the Atlanta Fed, the GIC over the years will develop and has developed the program which will take place in Argentina, and in earlier times had programs all over the world. We partnered with the Philadelphia Fed, we meaning the Global Interdependence Center, and the Atlanta Fed in a worldwide conference on food and water on 5 continents. And the Atlanta Fed was one of our partners. At the time, Dennis Lockhart was the president, and he was very supportive of that effort. And unbeknownst to many in the room, one of the things he did, and the Atlanta Fed did, was help a country, Zambia, which was experiencing inflation rates because of our ethanol policy, and they are a maize-based country. So 50% of their price index was being influenced by Washington in Zambia. And with the help of the Atlanta Fed, and a little facilitated by the Global Interdependence Center, helped Zambia develop the price index so it could handle monetary policy issues. So there's a long relationship with the Atlanta Fed. Dave Altick, the Director of Research, is one of the active leaders in the Global Interdependence Center. And so this panel and this session and this conference was enabled and helped because of the Atlanta Fed and our relationship with them. And that's how we got to meet Steve Kay, who is the director of the Americas Center at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and he will deal with the next panel. And Steve, we thank you for your help, panelists. We're happy to have you here, and I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you, David. And it's been wonderful working with the GIC and USF Sarasota-Manatee on this meeting, and it's great to see you all here. When we, actually, this is, you'll laugh, but I have to issue a disclaimer that my views are my own and not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. I see some Fed colleagues here, so I wanted to make sure I said that. When we thought of this panel, I thought of 2 people, and I thought if only we can get these 2 people, they're innovators, they're pioneers, they've done things that others hadn't done before, and if only they'd say yes, and they both immediately said yes. It was unbelievably easy, and I'm so grateful to have these 2 panelists with us. David Selesky's bank, Stonegate, was the first U.S. bank to establish a correspondent banking relationship with Cuba. My colleague, my Atlanta Fed colleague, Karen Gilmore, who's seated over there, who's the regional executive for our Miami branch, interviewed David for our publication Economy Matters. So you could go to our website, read the interview. You could read it in Spanish, Portuguese, or English, whichever you prefer. Rather than go over David's biography, but it's quite, he's going to say some interesting things. Anything he doesn't say today might be in that interview. And also seated next to me is Colin Laverty, who's been doing so much to build bridges between the United States and Cuba for so many years through his company, Cuba Educational Travel, which he founded, through his consulting, and through his tireless efforts on behalf of the Cuenta Propistas, who we heard about earlier today, the burgeoning entrepreneurial sector. Colin's been a real champion. And I'll just put in a plug that you might want to follow him on Twitter. He always has some interesting and important updates on Cuba. So I'm going to turn the floor to them, and we'll have questions afterwards. So we'll start with Colin.
And do this.
I think you're good.
Can you hear me okay in the back? So thank you, Steve, very much. It's been a pleasure. We met in Havana, which I think strong friendships are always built because of the unique and special atmosphere around you. So it's great to be together here. I'll just give you a tiny bit of context before I start my talk. As Steve mentioned, I run Cuba Educational Travel. We do all kinds of travel to Cuba. We work with about 100 universities on their study abroad programs. We do a lot of high schools, public and private, so we have a strong educational component. We're also, we do a lot in the corporate space, so a lot of trips for U.S. companies looking at the market. We're doing a lot of incentive and events. We did the first corporate retreat for a major U.S. company in Cuba in the last 55 plus years, which was Netflix, just about a year ago, and we've done them for Spotify and a number of other companies. We're doing a lot of luxury travel as well. There's been a lot of growth of kind of private flights to Cuba, luxury yachts. So we have a lot of business in that space. And then the traditional people-to-people, cultural and educational travel. There's been a tremendous amount of growth there as the Obama administration opened things up, making it easier to do business in Cuba and to legally travel there, and B, all of the excitement about Cuba in the news for a couple of years really drove interest. It was impossible to read the travel section of a magazine or a newspaper without Cuba being near the top of that list. Also, with that excitement, there was, of course, a lot of excitement in business opportunities in Cuba. So I've had the opportunity to work with a number of U.S. companies on their market exploration and, in some cases, market entry in Cuba. I did a lot of work with Airbnb, which has been mentioned today, that entered the Cuban market in April of 2015, and working with some other companies. And then on top of that, I spend most of my time in Havana. I'm married to a Cuban. That wasn't what brought me there, but I've spent the majority of the last 7 or 8 years living there. So that's kind of where I get my perspectives. What I thought I'd talk about today, I'll start with the current climate in Cuba. How many people here have traveled to Cuba before? How many of you were there in 2015, 2016? So you'll probably remember kind of the excitement, the optimism, and the sense of there's no turning back. It was palpable in the air. You could cut it. Not only was Havana the place to be, but Havana, or Cuba in general, there was a brighter future, better relations with the United States, reform process internally. There was no turning back. If you visit Havana, or Cuba today, I should say, there's a very different feeling. There's one of uncertainty, there's one of frustration, pessimism, etc. I'd say a lot of that comes from what I refer to as the perfect storm with the Trump administration. And then certainly some of that is also the result of things slowing down internally and kind of challenges there in terms of they try and find their way forward. I would suggest when you analyze Cuba or U.S.-Cuba relations or South Florida for that matter, I'd recommend that you look at it from within the context of 60 years and also over the last 5 to 10 years. And when you look at Cuba going forward or Miami going forward or U.S.-Cuba relations going forward, look at it in the context of the next 5 to 10 years, not the next 6 months, not the next 12 months, not the next 18 months. And I think you'll get more out of it, and I think it's a more appropriate exercise. So just, I think the most important word in all of these three aspects, whether it's South Florida and kind of exile politics, internal change in Cuba, or the U.S.-Cuba relationship, the key word is change. I think that's fundamental. If you look at change in Cuba, you'll see Raul Castro will step down just about almost exactly 2 months from today. He's going to be leaving behind a very different country than the one that he took over 8 years ago, or the one that we knew 5 to 10 years ago. If you look at a country that didn't have any access to internet, there was almost non-existent private sector, very little travel of Cubans traveling abroad, freely for vacation and for personal trips, not just to the Soviet Union or Soviet states for technical trips. A real estate market, purchasing and selling homes. Airbnb, I think, has had a fundamental impact for several reasons, but business with the U.S. And so I'd say probably the most fundamental difference, and I'd say to some extent what Raul Castro's legacy is a shift of mentality in Cuba. Not of everyone, maybe not some people at the top, and maybe not the majority of the Communist Party, but if you look at the majority of 11 million Cubans, the way that they see themselves, their future, their reality in the world is much different than it was 10 years ago. And I'd also say the way that they see the relationship with the United States and what the relationship with the United States should be is fundamentally different. And so I think there's no putting that genie back in the bottle, and then you would multiply, or in addition to that, we have this upcoming leadership transition. And so for the first time in 50 plus years, you won't have a Castro as the head of state, and you'll have a lesser known younger generation of leaders who are going to have to at some point make important policy decisions and have a political platform and some sort of approach to the future. If you look at change in U.S. policy, which I won't go too deep into because I think everyone's to some extent familiar with what happened under the Obama administration, I'd say fundamentally trade, travel, and talking to each other would be the three places where we saw the most growth. Diversifying travel, and the numbers don't lie. It's a tough moment right now because of the negative narrative and the perfect storm that are referred to. But if you look at kind of an explosion of U.S. travel, Cuban Americans and and non-Cuban Americans to Cuba, there's been incredible growth there. The Obama administration opened up many loopholes to trade and invest in Cuba, from telecom to agriculture. There's a very broad category for the good of the Cuban people that potentially licenses any type of business deal with Cuba if you can prove that it's to the benefit of the Cuban people. That can be selling buses, that can be redoing the electric or the water infrastructure. So there's tremendous potential there for U.S. companies legally to do business in Cuba, and then talking to each other. And this is something that's still taking place under the current administration, but talking about environmental cooperation, drug interdiction, cooperation on security matters. And I'd say that that's also had a very important impact. The Trump administration, I'd say there's still a lot of uncertainty about exactly what that means. I'm going to talk about that later. But of course, it's also change in policy in terms of what the Trump administration has done. And then I'd also, one of the, I think, most important areas to look is change in South Florida. If you look at evolving politics and what the importance of that means for this relationship, if you look at, I think one of the key figures, John Kerry won 25% of the Cuban American vote in 2004 with a more open policy to Cuba. Barack Obama won 35% in 2008, and then in 2012 he split that vote 50% after making some more far-reaching open reforms towards policy towards Cuba. The same thing happened with the Trump, in the Trump-Clinton, that vote was split. So this idea that the older, harder line anti-Castro Cubans still control the policy, I'd say that's fundamentally wrong. We'll see what happens with voter registration in the coming years, but polls show that an overwhelming majority of Cuban Americans support trade, travel, engagement with Cuba. I'd argue that the Marco Rubios and his colleagues don't represent the majority. We'll see as more Cubans register to vote. Many of them haven't become citizens yet, or they haven't registered, or they're not active politically. I think the number of Puerto Ricans and other Latinos making their way to the state of Florida and where their political preferences lie will be important. Beyond that, I'd look at another factor, which would be informal investment from Cuban Americans. There was talk earlier today that the Airbnb might have been the sons of generals, which perhaps that's happening. I'd say the majority of the Airbnbs, the startup capital, actually comes from South Florida. We're talking, estimates. A lot of it's informal, but between $2.5 to $5 billion per year coming from Cubans abroad to the private sector and the informal economy in Cuba, and what that means for the relationship. And then I'd add on to that increased connectivity. So if you look at the amount of travel back and forth of Cubans that live in the United States visiting Cuba, Cubans that live in Cuba but spend some of their time in South Florida. If you listen to the music, 25 years ago when a salsa group from Cuba wanted to perform in Miami, there was bombs going off outside. Now you hear the same exact music in Little Havana that you do in Havana, the same haircut. The cultural affinities and the connectivity is something that's really hard, to move backwards. And then you add the internet into that, and we talked about the Wi-Fi hotspots. If you go to one of these parks in Cuba, you'll see that 75 to 80% of these Cubans are talking to their relatives abroad or sharing information, using Facebook. Cuba is the fastest growing social media country in the world the last 2 years. So this connectivity between Cubans on and off the island is a driver in change in Cuba. It's a driver in change in South Florida and South Florida politics. And it's a driver in change in the U.S.-Cuba relationship. And I would expect to see continued change on that front. In terms of the U.S.-Cuba relationship, I mentioned there's bilateral talks on an almost weekly basis where delegations of the Cuban government, despite all of the problems that we have, we're sitting down and we're collaborating on issues of mutual concern. So that's something that was taboo years ago, and now it's a staple of our policy, and I don't think there's any, with the proximity and the potential for oil spills and the hurricanes that hit both Cuba and South Florida, how can we not talk to each other? I think there's folks, members of Congress that tried to prevent that because they don't want confidence building. They don't want us to look at areas of cooperation, but I think, that's something of the past. We're going to continue to talk to each other. I mentioned before the robust formal and informal relationship between Cubans and on and off the island, I think, is a driver. I agree. We talked this morning about the opening under the Obama administration and the potential for U.S. trade and investment, given regulatory changes and a policy of the U.S. government that was pushing U.S. companies to invest. And so there's a lot of, I think there's certainly validity to the claim that the Cuban government did not go fast enough or far enough during that opening to kind of really make the Obama policy permanent and irreversible, and really take advantage of that moment to do business with U.S. companies. And I think there is validity to that argument. At the same time, if you look at Airbnb, at Stonegate, you look at commercial flights going back and forth, you look at roaming agreements for cell phone companies, the cruise ships, Starwood's, now Marriott signed a deal for 3 hotels, General Electric signed MOU, they have a couple of business deals in the work, Caterpillar, John Deere. So a lot has happened, And if you look at Trump's speech in June, he recognized this, and a big part of his policy was, I'm not going to affect current and ongoing business. And so those were important changes that I think did cement, to a certain extent, the Obama policy and made it very difficult to go backwards. I'd also say, I started with the change in kind of the feeling in Cuba compared to 2 years ago. It's incredibly depressing. It's the same thing, from a policy analysis of the U.S.-Cuba relationship. Where we are right now is incredibly depressing. I mean, and if you look at the actual optics of it, of the thousands of Cuban families that are suffering because the embassy is closed and they cannot get a visa to go to their grandparents' funeral, to see their cousin's wedding. If you look at the economic impact of tens of thousands of entrepreneurs who invested their life savings to start, rental properties or restaurants, and it was U.S. policy to promote the private sector in Cuba, and this current policy that is taking away their livelihoods. It's incredibly depressing. It's wrong. But at the same time, when you look at the context and you imagine a very hostile U.S. president, a very emotional U.S. president who gets linked up with Marco Rubio and his colleagues who are incredibly strategic, they're incredibly well organized, incredibly effective, and he essentially outsources a significant portion of his policy to those people who have made their career out of preventing anything, U.S.-Cuba from going forward. And you add to that suspicious incidents involving U.S. dissidents that essentially the messaging months ago was that some mysterious, sophisticated weapon was blowing people's ears off while they slept. And on top of that, and that was known, the president was briefed on that before he went to Miami to give his speech. And on top of that, when he gave his speech and his policy directive, about 5% of what the Obama administration did was rolled back. 95% of it is still in place. So it's almost unthinkable that we're not in a worse position than we are now. And I'd even say certain things, like it was interesting to watch Marco Rubio when the president made his speech in Miami, and immediately everyone recognized this is going to fundamentally destroy the livelihoods of the private sector in Cuba. That was the biggest message that came out of President Trump's speech in Miami was, you are taking away the livelihood of the private sector in Cuba. And for the first time, Marco Rubio, who a year prior had said there was no private sector in Cuba. That is false. Everyone is a communist, everyone works for the government, and there are no entrepreneurs. And for the first time, he was tweeting backwards, saying, no, we're going to fix it. We're going to carve out loopholes so that the private sector is not affected. And so I would say that's a significant change, that for the first time, he admitted that there are independent entrepreneurs in Cuba. There's change, so it's happening. And I'd say that, on top of that, I'd like to think that the leadership transition in Cuba, it's not going to be a catalyst for change in U.S. policy, but I think down the road, it'll make it a little bit more palatable for some U.S. policymakers to sit down and talk to a government that's not led by the Castro government. So I'll just finish, if I'm doing okay on time. The leadership transition in Cuba, what's going on, what's the significance? If anyone knows, let me know, because it's a very opaque, there's not a lot of transparency into the decision-making process in Cuba. I would say it's clear that there's some tension and debate, at the top and within policy circles in Cuba. Not necessarily, maybe there's debate about whether Díaz-Canel is the right person or not, but I'd say the more fundamental debate is about what is the path forward. Are we going to continue to open? Are we going to slow things down? And I would suspect that there's a healthy debate there, and that there's people from different institutions that are arguing different things on, what the relationship with the U.S. should be, what the private sector should look like, the amount of foreign direct investment, the amount of connectivity, et cetera. And I think that I think there is a real debate happening there, and I think there's reformists, and I think there's conservatives, and I think they're trying to figure it out. I think some of it's based on ideology, some of it's based on control, some of it's based on inequality. I think with the private sector in particular, we heard this morning there's new regulations, and they've certainly taken steps to freeze it. I think some of it's because of control. They want to control it. Some of it's because they're worried about growing inequality. There's probably some people in there that realize that when they opened the private sector, they didn't establish a wholesale market. They had an unrealistic tax system. And so some of it might be stuff that they're trying to fix in terms of tax evasion and the fact that a lot of materials are disappearing off the backs of trucks. So it's tough to figure out exactly what the drivers are, but there's a healthy debate. What's clear is that the new government is going to have huge challenges. The current government, the new government, there are huge challenges. For the new leader, it's a very tough economic situation. There's external factors like Venezuela, internal currency reform, all kinds of real economic challenges. Legitimacy, this isn't a person who fought in the mountains. This isn't a person that can, look at the stripes or the stars on their uniform. They have to find their legitimacy, whether, they have to find their legitimacy within the party, their legitimacy with the army, their legitimacy with the population. So it'll be interesting to see how they move internally to shore up support and then to some extent with public opinion. And I think there's a significant challenge in terms of how they engage young people. How do you figure out a way to connect with the younger generation people and get them to invest in your political platform? And then I'd say one of the big things, and this goes to legitimacy, economics, politics, is balancing the risk of doing something with bad results with not doing anything at all, and what that implies. And I think there's a lot of that going on. With Diaz-Canel himself, his vision is not clear. I think we suspected a couple of years ago that he was a reformer because he'd given progressive policy speeches about the internet and the media. He listened to the Beatles and had long hair when that wasn't really the right thing to do. He's the only government official that carries a tablet around. Then a year ago, this video is leaked of him in front of Communist Party members saying kind of really hardline things about the private sector and about the U.S. and showing his credentials of how he's a hardliner. I don't think we really know who he is. We'll have to wait and see. But I would say, you can control the private sector and there's reforms to kind of constrain it. They can try and slow down the internet to a certain extent, but the genie's out of the bottle on all of those things. There's no going backwards. And then when you look at the larger structural reforms that are needed, increased foreign direct investment, inefficient state-owned enterprises, currency reform, those are things that absolutely have to happen at some point to impede a collapse. So it's clear that those will have to happen. And so I just finished by saying one of the factors that's so sad about this whole thing is anyone who understands Cuba, and Ambassador said it the other day when she was in Havana, the more hostility on the U.S. side, the less space there is in Cuba internally to push for change. And I think that is one of the reasons why we saw so much movement in a short period of time when the Obama administration opened up to Cuba. And I think it's clearly one of the reasons why there's less space for that change. So it's really unfortunate. Cuba's going through the most important transition in the last 55 years, and the U.S., rather than playing a constructive role in making that a transition that we would like to see and that would be good for U.S. interests, we're doing the exact opposite. So what I'd say with given these challenges and the balancing act, when Diaz-Canel becomes president in April, I wouldn't expect very much of anything in the first 6 to 12 months, but I think 18 months in, 24 months in, he's going to have to look to deal with some of these challenges and secure his legitimacy. And so I think there is potential to see Cuba continue moving forward with reform.
Yeah, so I think it's important when you're a speaker, you got to kind of give context to where you're coming from and everything. I'm going to mostly just address how U.S. businesses have done over the last 2 years, where there's been success, where there's been roadblocks, what are those roadblocks, and so on. Our journey, Stonegate Bank, which is now part of Centennial Bank, even though we still do business in Cuba under Stonegate Bank, we actually did a better job of branding the name in Cuba than we did in the U.S., but that's a different story. It all really started back in March of 2015. State Department called me. We banked an agricultural company that was trading with Cuba. A big stumbling block in opening the embassies was that no bank was willing to bank the Cuban embassy or Cuban interest section at that point. I met with Ambassador Cabaños actually in the Miami airport speaking about challenges. He wasn't allowed to travel from the airport to Pompano to visit with me. I had to go meet him in the airport, and like all good men, we had 3 beers and we solved the world's crisis right there and moved on, right? So I went back to the bank, and the next day I met with my executive management team and told them, look, we're gonna move forward with this thing. And they all said, what a great idea. And then they went home and updated their resumes, I think, because every CEO, they tell you what you want to hear. And from there, we really got very comfortable with not only just the banking system in Cuba, but with dealing with the Cuban government. Always followed through on whatever they said. From there, back, I think it was in June of 2016, we opened a correspondent bank account with BICSA, the first U.S. bank to do that, so far the only U.S. bank to do that. And that allowed us to be able to transfer money. So we're the only bank in the U.S. that can transfer money and get it there the same day. So what's happened since then, obviously, is I'd say probably 70 to 80% of all U.S. companies that do business in Cuba, they have some form of an account from us, whether it's the cruise lines, the airlines. Pretty much everybody does business with it, unless they've got some foreign subsidiary that I route the money through. And then from there, we worked with MasterCard to set up debit cards and credit cards for U.S. travelers going down there. The significance of that was, most of you have traveled to Cuba before, you've got to bring a whole bunch of cash with you, right? Well, it's nice to be able to go to an ATM machine and be able to pull the money out. You can avoid the 10% embargo tax. And at the time, we felt like that was going to be very, very meaningful. And we plan on expanding that service going forward. So that's really the context of how the bank got involved. A couple quick facts. So just I want to, one of the things we realized real fast, everybody was coming to us with ideas about, well, how they wanted to do business in Cuba. But I think there was a real, and you read in the paper about how, this company didn't get anywhere and that company didn't get anywhere and all that kind of stuff. Flat out, a lot of it was they just didn't really do their market research. And, I'm going to throw a couple quick facts out there, which you probably all know about Cuba, but I'm going to throw them out there anyways. The population is 11.3 million. It is a poor country. I mean, the GDP is $77 billion. Miami-Dade County with 2.3 billion is 111 billion. It just tells you there's not a consumer sector to buy a vast amount of U.S. goods. Life expectancy, 79 years old there. Despite the black beans and rice diet, they actually live 1 year older than U.S. citizens do. So people live a long time. 70 to 80% of the food is imported to Cuba, which is probably the biggest failure, in my opinion, of the revolution, is the fact that, as anybody who's spent any time and traveled through Cuba, I mean, the soil's incredibly productive, huge amount of opportunity, the growth of population throughout the world. There's a great opportunity there once they become self-sufficient in food, if they ever do, also to be an exporter. Tourism, 4 to 5 million a year. 30% of the population is employed in the private sector. That doesn't mean that they own the business. It means that there may be a waiter or a waitress that works at a palador and so on. Biggest thing, you mentioned the remittances. That's something we haven't really talked about. 3.4 billion, 4 billion, around that number is what we hear. Most of that's coming out of the United States. When you look at that GDP, if you were to pull that out, it's a huge piece of what keeps Cuba going. Obviously, the Venezuela has been a huge impact to the economy there. Now you're seeing that move more towards Russia. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then, they're also facing the same crisis that a lot of Western nations are facing. That's a demographic crisis. I've had a lot of young people that have left, emigrated to U.S., Spain, other countries. They got social services they got to pay for. And so they're probably in a little bit worse condition than a lot of Western countries in terms of how they're going to pay for these social services as their population ages. So, but it was interesting when all this came about. I'd have people like a Mercedes-Benz dealership come to me. I want to open a Mercedes-Benz dealership in Cuba. I'm like, okay, well, who's going to buy the car? And so this was a big roadblock. So when you really look at what was successful, what wasn't successful. Obviously, the travel services area. I would say out of the 85 to 90 companies that we transfer money for, probably 70 of them are related to travel. Obviously the big airlines, the cruise lines. Talking to the cruise lines executives, they're all expanding their services, especially since the people-to-people travel went away. That's the easiest way for people to go to Cuba. So we're seeing a huge upswing of that. Unfortunately, from an economic standpoint, I think that has the least economic benefit to Cuba. People are not staying in an Airbnb. Chances are they're taking their meal on the cruise ship. They go buy a few trinkets. They go on a tour of a rum factory, and then that's it. So that goes back to really hurting the private sector and the new regulatory reforms that it really has impacted. But so when you really look at the scale, so from a travel services standpoint, U.S. companies have really done very well in Cuba, and will continue to do well in Cuba. An area where where we were not successful was despite Stonegate being in there, the Cuban government was very anxious to get larger banks involved, larger financial institutions. And I'll explain why in a minute. But the regulatory environment was such that when I first told my regulators I was going to bank the Cuban embassy, they said, "Dave, we really like you, but have you lost your mind?" That has been a big issue. So the Bank of Americas, the Wells Fargos, the Citibanks, and everything. While they had meetings, they never could get anywhere with it. And that was more a function of just the regulatory environment at that time, which was very tough. As a matter of fact, most U.S. banks were trying to pull back on correspondent relationships. It's becoming a big problem with some Caribbean countries and Central American countries that are really starved for U.S. banking services because it's very difficult. So why is that important? There were a lot of U.S. companies, I really can't go through the names, but large U.S. companies that went down there, had letters of intent signed to sell substantial goods to Cuba. But the catch was the Cubans want everything financed. Everything. We'll talk about agricultural in a minute. So the Canadian banks, some of them do it. The Spanish banks do. There's a bank in Panama that does that. The reality of it is their bucket's full. And everybody has country risk, and so they have limits. That's part of their whole stress testing and how you manage your bank's balance sheet. So, these companies inevitably came to Stonegate. We were a $3 billion bank at that time, and we were like, look, we're not really in a position to do this at the scale that you guys need to. So there was a big misnomer, I think, in terms of that the Cubans were unwilling to do business with these U.S. companies. I think they were very willing to do it. It's just that they have a policy that they finance everything, including agriculture. And it was very difficult for them to find somebody who would be willing to do that. And, some of the Canadian banks did a little bit of it, but, they have their people in Canada that's been supporting Cuba for a long time. And the other thing, too, that I think what U.S. companies missed is, if you've had a company that you've been doing business with and you're in Cuba for the last 20 years and you've endured what the embargo has done, because if you're doing business in Cuba, it's very difficult to do business in the U.S., right, during certain points of that embargo. So there's a lot of loyalty there to those companies. And so a U.S. company may have came in with a better product, better pricing, forget the financing part of it, but the loyalty of Cuba was such that we're going to continue to move forward with that. And I think a lot of U.S. companies really didn't understand that. We're such uber capitalists, so to speak, and give me the best deal and the best terms, and I'm going with it. And they couldn't quite grasp it here. There's, look, this company's been through thick and thin with Cuba. Maybe didn't always get paid on time and whatnot, and so they stuck with that. So I think, that was a big issue. So financing is a big issue. This agricultural bill that didn't even get off the committee floor to finance agriculture. Centennial Bank, which purchased Stonegate last year, Arkansas really wants to sell agricultural goods. you talk to the Cubans, they're very willing to buy our agricultural goods, but they need them to be financed. It's just, you cannot do it under the embargo. So that's kind of where the regulatory environment is. I will agree with Colin, not much has changed really from a business standpoint. I think, the embassies, having to pull back on the embassies obviously makes it a little bit more difficult to do business, but certainly the Cubans are willing to look at U.S. businesses. They see that as a great way to increase the ties, eventually use U.S. businesses to probably get that embargo lifted to put pressure on Congress. But I haven't really seen much of a pullback. As Colin mentioned, I think the big loser out of this whole regulatory thing has really been the private entrepreneur in Cuba, and they are suffering. The U.S. traveler going down there spending money, because a lot of it was more into services and travel. I mean, they're really suffering. We've seen restaurants closed, so the stated policy of our government to support them actually it whiplashed the other way. So I think the business is open. I think but I think the one thing I would caution anybody who wants to do business in Cuba: do your market research. Really understand what you're going in. People were just so excited and they just rushed to it, and I think there was a bad reputation that happened. Cubans don't want to do business. That just wasn't the case. I can tell you there was some very large companies that were ready to do business. They just couldn't get the financing.
So as the moderator, I'm going to take advantage of my powerful position to ask two quick questions, and hopefully I'll model asking really quick questions that others can follow. First, Colin, can I, as an individual, just go to Cuba now? Because we talked about there's no longer people to people, but say someone here just wants to go and they don't want to go on a cruise, and they don't want to go in a large group.
So, my turn down here.
Yeah.
If you ask the State Department or the Treasury Department, they probably won't give you a good answer, which is what they have done so far. It's been incredibly vague, and I would say intentionally confusing. A big part of President Trump's policy that he announced in June was getting rid of individual people-to-people travel, which was how most people were traveling. They were basically checking a box when they bought their direct flight. They were staying at an Airbnb, and kind of under good conscience, they weren't going to the beach and drinking mojitos, but they were spending their day finding an independent guide, stopping by the agricultural market, checking out an art gallery, and really talking informally to Cuba. And most people that have traveled there will probably know Cubans are so welcoming and so talkative that there was a tremendous amount of, whether it was intentional or unintentional, people-to-people activity. So one of the big things that he did was say, people-to-people now has to go back to a company or an organization that they organize, a 4 or 5 activity a day trip, and that they send somebody, to make sure that you're doing all that stuff, which just increases the cost, makes it less attractive, more difficult, and really confuse people. I mean, one of the biggest impacts of President Obama going to Cuba, he brought his wife and kids because he wanted to show Americans you can travel to Cuba and you should travel to Cuba, and that had a very significant impact. And the president's speech in June, that was the first step in the perfect storm of confusing and scaring people away from traveling to Cuba. I mentioned Marco Rubio twittering backwards. What did happen is there's a category called support for the Cuban people, which basically says if you're going down with the intention of helping the Cuban people, private entrepreneurs or neighborhood organizations, nonprofits, you can go on your own. And so the State Department's really done kind of a balancing act, because nobody wants to explain to the president that one of the fundamental parts of his new policy has been watered down by bureaucrats who see the importance of continuing to support the private sector. So essentially they carved out that loophole, and yes, you can go as an individual. We submitted a license application or a sample itinerary to the Treasury Department weeks ago, and they confirmed to us that if you go and you spend your time supporting private entrepreneurs and visiting private restaurants and talking to Cubans, you can go under that category. They won't say it publicly, but that is the case. So yes, you can. But I'd agree with Dave that most Americans, it was the June 16th speech that said it's not legal to travel to Cuba, whether that was true or not. Then you had these sonic weapons blowing people's heads off. The State Department, I think, has been, they've completely fumbled that, which I think is disrespectful to the diplomats who did suffer, health problems. I think it's been incredibly mishandled and it's been politicized. And so all of that has really affected travel to Cuba, which is down 45% compared to a year ago. But you should go. I think it's one of the things that we can do as private citizens to keep things moving forward. And so I would encourage everyone to travel to Cuba.
Okay. My second, hopefully quick question. Ambassador Huddleston this morning talked to us about how relations between the U.S. and Cuba have gone through these cycles, warm, cold, upgrade, downgrade. Clearly now we're in a downgrade and we're sort of trying to sort out what's going on. I just want to ask both of you to step back a couple steps and thinking sort of more historically, sort of along the lines of what the ambassador was speaking about this morning. If you could sort of project ahead to sort of the medium term, and this is a hard question and you don't really have to answer it, but how do you see things, assuming there is an upgrade and the cycle kind of turns the pendulum kind of turns the other way, what do you foresee sort of the next time? Right? Because we had this, now I'm doing the long-winded thing, I'm modeling what not to do. In September of 2017, there was a financial summit in New York City. David was the keynote speaker. People were there from Wall Street, from the big US banks, from the Cuban Central Bank, the Cuban state-owned banks, Google, so it was big. And there was that feeling, like this is happening. And so, and now we're in a different stage, and I'm just wondering if you want to think about what the next stage might look like.
Well, I think it all depends on us. The Cubans, if we push, they push back. I mean, so it's not the Cubans causing the issues. I know historically, when Fidel was in there was a more cult of personality, and there was more going on. But today, it's all about what U.S. policy is. So the more we push, the more we clamp down, the more support you give to the hardliners in that government, and the more they will clamp down on the private entrepreneurs, the more they will do less business with the U.S. I mean, so it really is incumbent upon us. If our policies change and we warm up, then I think then they will loosen up as well. It was interesting. We were all kind of Obama did some great things, but I think going back, I don't think he really made this irreversible. And it was in a lot of the meetings I had with Cuban government officials was always like, well, this can all get undone. I'm like, nah, it ain't going to happen. Well, they turned out to be right. And once again, the U.S. changed policies. And I think, for them, you're seeing, Cuba's going to move towards. They have to have a friend in the world. Now they're moving more towards Russia. I mean, that is a huge problem for us. We see, you go there in flights and you used to see flights from Moscow and it'd all be people wearing Hawaiian shirts and stuff. Now you see people with business suits on, getting on those flights. You see, you used to drive by the Soviet embassy. It's a very unique, it used to be dead. Now you're starting to see all these cars outside. He says, the Russians are moving in, they've got to befriend somebody. Venezuela's gone away. But, so I think, perhaps if we don't do something fairly quickly, that may become irreversible. So, I think we just got to be very, very careful. But it's always a yin and a yang. And I think it really starts with Washington, and then Havana reacts. But I think it's important that we support those reformists that are in the government that want some form of reform. But every time we push, the hardliners come to the front.
Yeah, I would agree completely. And I'd like to be optimistic, and that's why I tried to start by saying let's not look at the next 6 to 12 to 18 months, but let's look at the next 5 to 10 or 3 to 5. And I'd say if you look at it that way, I think in Cuba, there can be bumps in the road with the private sector. There can be, concern about whether to make these structural reforms that they need to make. But I do think there's been a significant amount of change in Cuba in the last 10 years. It's a very different country. And I suspect that there'll be a tremendous amount of change going forward. I don't think there's any other way for Cuba to survive and to move into the 21st century besides adapting its social, political, and economic system. I'd also say in the United States, I mean, if you look from Cuban Americans to U.S. companies to the general public, there really has been a significant amount of change in the way we look at our relationship with Cuba today compared to 5 or 10 years ago. And I'd say that I would hope that that will continue to progress. And, you know, I don't think it's sustainable for 5 or 6 members of Congress to kidnap U.S. national interest. They've been incredibly successful for a long time, but I think change in South Florida is incredibly important, and I'd like to be optimistic that there'll be change in Congress and going forward. And I just add with President Trump, it's incredibly depressing where we are. You know, you look at somebody who had his team in Cuba just a few years ago looking at hotels and golf courses, and during the primary said that he agreed with President Obama's policy towards Cuba. You also look at the person who's advising him, who he refers to as Little Marco. I'd like to be somewhat optimistic that at some point Little Marco might get thrown under the bus. And if you look at the Cuban government, one thing that you can give them a lot of credit on is that when President Trump celebrates the death of Fidel Castro or calls them, you know, the worst names you could ever imagine, they do not respond. They say, we would like to have a better relationship with the United States. That would never have happened with Fidel Castro. You would have had 11 million Cubans marching every day for the last 18 months. And so we'll have to see where things go, but I think public opinion and national interest and change in Cuba is all on our side.
So questions? Bump.
Just, I know the JIC has meetings. Oh, I'm sorry. The JIC has meetings in Argentina. There's going to be one coming up. There's been several, but Argentina might be a good prototype for the relationship between U.S. and Cuba, because in Argentina, relations have gotten a lot better. They did have a new president come in, and reforms and overtures to the U.S., like paying their debt and things like that, that changed the whole interface between the two countries. And that was really initiated from the Argentine side to the U.S. after they had a new government come in place. We often hear our side of what we should do and what we can do. But what would you recommend the 1 or 2 things that the new Cuban government could do to make overtures to the U.S. to be more conciliatory toward them? Because it seems to me that there's a lot of people-to-people goodwill that wants these things to eventually happen. And with a new government there, what would be the things that they could do to say to the U.S., yes, we'd like to have that relationship with you in a more positive way than it's been the last 60 years or whatever?
So I would say, and this is one of the reasons why the Trump factor is so counterproductive. It's very hard for the Cubans, because of the history even prior to the revolution and everything that this current Cuban government prides itself on. It's very difficult for them to make internal changes based on the idea that then the U.S. government will respond. They feel like they shouldn't be making internal changes. They don't ask the United States to change their internal system, et cetera. So I don't think it'll be phrased in that tit for tat. I do think that the Cubans, forgetting about the United States and whether the U.S. responds to it or not, Cuba making changes at home clearly sends a signal to the U.S. and everyone else that it's more appropriate to engage. And so I think that, I do think the currency reform is the most significant economic reform that they need to make. Everything else is based on that. I think doing the currency reform, something they said they were going to do 7 or 8 years ago, and they've kicked the can down the road, that would send a signal to the whole world that they're serious about entering into a phase 2 of restructuring their economy. So I think that's important. I think, there was a delegation of 3 senators and 3 members of the House there this week, and Cuba sent a strong message that they want to continue normalizing with the United States. I mentioned before Diaz-Canel, who's suspected to become the new president. He hasn't said much, and what he's said has kind of been very geared at hardliners in Cuba. I think it'd be very positive if the new government, shortly after it takes power, reiterates that they'd like to continue normalizing relations with the U.S. So I think those are some of the things that would help continue moving forward.
Well, the Cubans take their sovereignty very seriously. And you got to, going back to the history again, I mean, it was basically a semi-colony that we controlled up until the time of revolution. So they take it very seriously. What I've seen in just dealing with the State Department is we always put conditions on everything. We'll talk to you if you do this, this, and this, and this. That's the exact opposite of what you want to do with the Cubans. I mean, you just want to go say, look, let's just have a dialogue and let the Cuban government, let the Cuban economy evolve. But we demand, okay, let go of this, do that, do this, and then we'll sit down and talk to you. And that has the opposite effect with the Cubans and how they react to it. They just take their sovereignty very, very seriously. And I think this is the wrong approach. A classic example, we talk about, if you read the regulation, the final regulation that came out from Trump, it talks about, we want American travelers to go down there and talk bad about the government. We want to support the private enterprise down there because that's going to ultimately undermine the government. It's almost like a chess player sitting there saying, look, I'm going to tell you my next 2 moves, okay? Let's start playing chess. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Our policy towards Cuba, we're not having a dialogue with them as equals. It's always we've got to be demanding something. And I think it's about their sovereignty, and that's just the way they view things. And they're just not going to, you tell them, look, you do this and this, they're going to do the opposite. I mean, that's just been my experience.
All right, so, yeah.
In continuing with his question and addressing to you, do you feel that maybe addressing human rights violations in Cuba that still exist, imprisonment of dissidents like the Mothers in White, etc., could ease tension not only with the government, with the Cuban American population out of Miami?
Yeah, I think that making strides on a more open society, including human rights, be incredibly impactful. I always, I'm not a human rights expert. I would defer to Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the United Nations, all of whom have said that a more open U.S. policy towards Cuba helps the human rights situation on the island. So I would gear my, expertise on that through every single credible human rights organization in the world that has criticized the embargo and said that it actually opens up less space for pluralism and debate in Cuba. I'd also say I think sometimes things are too black and white. I'd look at the pluralism question a little bit more broadly than just a few human rights organizations who clearly deserve their space. They should not be treated the way that they are. But I'd also look at it through the lens of internet, for example, and how important it is that you now have millions of Cubans on uncensored internet. I'd argue that the impact of that in terms of what the goals of U.S. policy are for a more open society, 3 to 4 million Cubans on Facebook and Instagram and talking to their family abroad, in real political terms, is probably going to have more of an impact than one of the human rights groups. And I'm not discrediting what they're doing. I'm just saying looking at the actual policy. And so that's the other thing that I would encourage about not looking at it so black and white. How do we empower reformers within the university system, within the Communist Party, within the state companies that are going to be the ones pushing for more open policies? If you want to look at real change in Cuba and what's smart policy, I think sometimes we handicapped ourselves by making it so black and white and so emotional and not looking at the big picture.
Yeah, I think it goes back to engagement again, and same thing with the internet. I mean, if you went there 10 years ago, it was, the information they got about the U.S. was whatever movie they were able to get, right? Now they got the internet, Facebook, you see people talking on the phone to relatives throughout the world. I mean, they're traveling more, and I think that's really what's going to lead to change, not belittling human rights violations in Cuba or any other country. But, I think it's an evolutionary process, and I think once again, getting back to the U.S. government's philosophy is we want a revolutionary change instead of an evolutionary change. And I think really an evolutionary change is probably more acceptable and more likely to happen with Cuba.
Okay.
What have been the problem to implement the currency reform?
What was
About the issues with implementing a currency reform.
You said that 8 years ago they wanted to change the double currency, but they haven't succeeded yet, or they haven't implemented it yet. What have been the problem to do so earlier?
You want to take that one?
You want me to take it?
Or you guys?
Well, when we opened interestingly enough, when we opened our correspondent account almost 2 years ago, we did it in U.S. dollars. We proposed doing it in CUCs, and the head of the central bank said, no, we're going to be reforming the currency any day now. So it's 2 years later, we haven't seen it. I think the biggest issue, my conversations, at least with the bankers down there, is they're worried about the impact. I mean, it's a very, very fragile economy, as we just went through the numbers, right? I mean, it's a very poor country. And how do you do that without creating a lot of dissatisfaction or inequality? And I think that's really been the issue. Hasn't been an unwillingness, it's just they're really worried about stability when they go through it. And I think that's really been the part. Now they've got, I think the European Union is sending a team in there to try to help them, who help the different currencies of different countries in Europe when they went to the European Union convert. So they are getting some outside international help, which makes me think that maybe it's coming along a little bit faster now, that they're back on track. I think they're just worried about inflation. They're worried about, those issues, because typically the state worker gets pesos, right? And the tourists and everyone else operates off CUCs, and it's just, they're very worried about how it's going to work.
They operate in CUC. If they want to pay in a store, they can use either currency, correct?
Well, there's really three currencies in Cuba. There's also the U.S. dollar, as well. I mean, there's a lot of hoarding of the U.S. dollars. And, it was interesting when they were talking, when I was down there and they were talking a lot about the currency reform, is people were actually wanting your U.S. dollars. They were nervous. They're very nervous about what was going on. So I don't know if there's an easy answer to it, but I do know the European Union is sending people there to help them go through the process. So.
Yeah, I would just add, I think one of the big challenges is that there's the public exchange rate, which is 1 to 25, and then you have various internal exchange rates that some companies operate at a 1 to 1, others at a 1 to 11. They've studied extensively to the extent that they can what the impact will be, but one of the big challenges is they don't really know which companies will be profitable or unprofitable, and really what the real impact of it will be. And I don't think it's just Cubans alone. I mean, there's EU support now. The World Bank's done some research on it, and there's varying opinions of whether you do gradual, whether you do big bang, how you do it. And they're, and it's a common, the way they've approached the reform process so far has really been, study, pilot projects, really trying to mitigate serious impact from those reforms. And so, but it has become clear that was one of the messages that they had for this congressional delegation that was there, and it was a big part of Raul Castro's speech in December, is that we have to do the currency reform.
So assuming that you make some money in Cuba, assuming that you successfully sell something to Cuba and you're paid in either Cuban pesos or CUCs, how does that work if you want to take out the money? Is that you can't convert pesos or CUC. So how do you get the profits out of Cuba?
It depends on the business, but many foreign investors have all of their arrangements made in foreign currencies, and you can have foreign currency bank accounts in Cuba. There's obviously, if you follow, there's been liquidity crises at different points over the last 10 years, where it's been one of the challenges for foreign investors when they want to get their money out. There's never been a case where they haven't been able to, but there are certain periods when the government's short on cash. And there's 2, 3, 4, 6-month periods where they can't move their money. But in general, that's happening in foreign currency that they're taking in and out.
Okay, well, unfortunately, our time is up. I'll guess fortunately, because we're about to have a delicious lunch. But I want to thank our panelists here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.